Hello and welcome to AIoT Hub. Very pleased to see everyone here tonight. If you're on live, please say hello and where you're dialing in from. Paul's away tonight; he's driving up to Newcastle, so it's just me and Shaun. Hello, Shaun. How are you tonight?
Hello, I'm really good, thank you. How are you keeping?
Where are you coming from?
Just north of Cambridge myself.
Okay.
Here in the UK.
So I'd like to thank the sponsor, the Edge AI Hub, and thanks for sponsoring the AI community in the UK. Paul's given me something to read out. Unfortunately, I didn't have much input into the next meetup. So he says, join us for a powerful roundtable featuring Afzal Mangal, author of IoT, The Hype No One Knows About, alongside the CTOs of Cisco and TD SYNNEX. This conversation will dig into the real challenges IoT still faces in moving beyond pilot purgatory. I'm sure we've all been on a few of those projects. How we normalize adoption and what it takes to drive market education and scalable success. So if you're not familiar with Afzal, he's a very frequent commenter on LinkedIn on all subjects IoT, a very engaging speaker. Expect bold insights, honest truths, and actionable takeaways from some of the most influential voices in the IoT ecosystem. So tonight we have two of my favorite subjects, beer and beer. If you've got questions, please ask them live and Shaun will answer them as we're going on. So I'll over to you, Shaun.
Okay, thank you. Right, can I just get a confirmation that you can see the screen? Shared the right one?
Yep, can see it fine.
Perfect, thank you. Right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today. And in this talk, you guessed it, I'm here to talk about beer and my attempts to brew some beer. So the inspiration for this talk came from a conversation that I had with a good friend. He has a really quite impressive home brew operation set up in his garage. He's using BrewPi, so that's a Python-based system that runs on a Raspberry Pi. And while we were tasting some of his beers, I saw it. I don't know if he challenged me or the beer challenged me to see what a .NET developer could do using only .NET in the space of IoT. So mentioning .NET, so just to jump and introduce myself, my name's Shaun Lawrence. I'm a software engineer and I've worked with .NET for nearly 20 years now, and I've actively researched good beer for even longer. This project, I will say, is very much a hobby rather than a professional project. However, recent work that I've done in the professional space has been around microcontroller-based systems, so that's certainly fed into my understanding. And I know that this meetup covers both AI and IoT. Now, the closest I will get to mentioning AI today is how proud I am that I was able to prompt some level of AI to generate this image on the screen. I fell in love with it and I ran away and printed some stickers. Now, I know this is a remote talk, but if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, then feel free to, and I've got plenty of stickers that I'm more than happy to post out. Right, so we can progress. To begin, I'd like to begin with a wise old proverb, which is give a person a beer and they drink for a day, or teach them to brew and you give them a hangover for life. So welcome to that hangover. Now they say you always remember your first time. Sadly, my camera roll does not, but I've picked some images off the internet that helped me relay the story. So back in 2008, I bought an extract kit of lager and I mixed the ingredients together in a bucket similar to the one above. I wrapped it in a towel just to add some extra level of insulation, and then I placed it in our airing cupboard in the middle of our house. Now I say it was outside, similar to this one. There was never actually enough space to fit it in. I left the lager there to brew for roughly 2 weeks, then siphoned it out into a keg, because obviously you can't pour from the bucket. Dropped a little of extra sugar in there to help with the carbonation side of things, and then left it for a further 2 weeks. And actually, this was a surprising success. Now, I don't know if it was beginner's luck, or the fact that the ambient temperature when I did it was springtime. So actually, that's a fairly ideal temperature for brewing lager, short of some of the weather we've had in the last couple of weeks. So yes, like I say, that was a big success, but mainly I believe that was down to the ambient temperature, because subsequent brews that I've done over things like the winter, while the airing cupboard can help, the immersion heater can obviously, it is expelling some heat into the house. It's not always great at regulating the temperature, and that's one of the key aspects of brewing beer. And to move on to the brewing process, like I say, I had a few kind of mishaps brewing around different times, so I had to take a step back. I bought this book, which I would thoroughly recommend if anyone's actually looking to learn how to brew beer. It's a bit like a brewing Bible. John kind of covers all aspects of brewing, more than I would probably be able to speak about right now. But like I say, it's a great book. It's quite chunky. It's a good read, and it's got some great recipes in there as well. So I thoroughly recommend it. So to look at what's actually involved in the brewing process, what we always typically start with is we want to keep things clean. So we want to make sure there's no germs or anything that's going to potentially grow within our brew other than the things we want to. Then we make something called wort. And anyone not familiar with wort, it's basically a liquid that's made up from grain, and it's intended to be turned into beer with the addition of some yeast. This is a rather large simplification. The actual creation of wort is an involved process. It typically entails mixing, heating, boiling. You'd add hops in at varying times to get the different flavors into the brew. You'd add malt, chill, and aerate. I've left this as a single bullet point because it is actually possible to entirely skip this by purchasing a malt extract, and sometimes that's quite a common thing that myself and my friend will do. We now typically sometimes buy in the extract, and then we'll take hops and just try to influence the flavor at certain points in the brewing process through that mechanism, rather than having to go, because the obviously you mentioned boiling and filtering bits out. It can be quite a messy process, and it's involved on the hob. So I try my best not to make as much mess in the kitchen as I can, because I'm looking for permission to build something, which we'll get to shortly. Then we have the fermentation phase, and this step is basically involves mixing the yeast and the wort together, and then you leave it untouched for typically up to about 2 weeks. And a key element of that is maintaining a good level of temperature control. Following on from that, we have the carbonation phase, and this typically involves either leaving it in your brewing vessel, depending if your vessel's capable of pouring out. So if you've got a keg with a tap in it, some people use a carboy, which is a bit like the plastic container on the top of a water cooler, although you can get glass ones as well. It's better for the pressure. Or you could bottle it as well, so depending on your preferred way of doing it. I've got a miniature kind of 10-pint keg that I bought with the kit, and I kind of reuse that because it's a nice size. Anything larger than that, and I'm going to be drinking for for a long time. And so yes, so the carbonation phase, what we typically do is we'd add a little bit of extra sugar into that, or some sugar solution. And the aim of that is to excite whatever yeast is left and cause the carbonation in the brew. And again, we do typically want to maintain a consistent temperature for that stage, and quite often that's a little bit higher than the fermentation phase. And then finally, one concept which is quite common in home brewing is to cold crash the beer at the end of the brewing process, and that involves dropping the temperature to effectively refrigeration temperatures, which the aim is to then force the yeast to go dormant and kind of drop to the bottom of the brew. And therefore, when you pour, you don't have to filter it out. You can just pour and just rely on the fact that gravity is keeping that at the bottom. So continuing on from the book, I'm going to quote the author now, because there's a good set of things to look at, and then hopefully we can work out how we can translate those into something that can be automated in the world of IoT. So the most important factor is keeping things clean. Don't worry, this is not going to turn into a clean architecture talk. But what we basically want to make sure is that the yeast is the only microorganism that is growing in the brew. Because obviously you could run into rather nasty stomach bugs or other things that you don't want to do. You just want to enjoy a good cold, crisp beer. After sanitation, we then have fermentation, and for a healthy fermentation, good temperature control is key. You might hear me saying temperature control quite a lot, because that will be a key focus of the talk today, and how we solve the problems, all the problems we're trying to solve. And so yeast are living organisms, and their activity, much like humans, is controlled by temperature. We want to find a happy temperature, maybe like the 28 degrees we had the other day for us humans, although that I certainly find I slow down when the temperature gets too hot. So we want to keep it at a good, happy temperature for that yeast. The third one that John says is important is proper yeast management. And I always feel strange saying that term. But essentially what it means is you want to be buying good quality yeast, and you want to be using the right quantity. You don't want extra yeast in there that will affect the flavor or potentially the alcohol content of your beer. And you obviously want enough to actually generate the flavor, otherwise it's going to taste rather off. The fourth most important one is the boil. So when you're making the wort, you want to make sure that you are boiling it for long enough, not over boiling it. And as with any typical recipe, if you follow one at home or you cook food, if you underboil pasta, it's not going to taste great. So there is obviously a key element of making sure that you cook the ingredients properly. And then finally, we have the recipe. And John, in his his list here, is referring to the list of ingredients and how they blend together to make a great tasting beer. And while I don't disagree with him, I'm going to use the term recipe as a set of steps that can be followed. So if we now take that list and we try to translate that into something that could be automated, we can cross some things off, we can highlight some things, and we can leave one untouched. So sanitation was the top priority, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to automate. But because it is top of the list, I don't want to cross it off. I didn't want to cross it off, but instead I've considered it a requirement or a constraint of the system. And certainly for hobbies like this, constraints on a project are a wonderful thing. They try to help me stay grounded and not allow the scope to creep too much. But what I've interpreted it to really mean is that a homebrew setup needs to be easy to clean, and therefore we could say we want to limit the number of components that are actually going to be exposed to the brewing process, and therefore reduce the number of things that actually need to be kept clean. Next, obviously, we've got the fermentation phase, and I've mentioned that temperature control is going to be a primary focus of today, so we can move on in the list. Yeast management, again, automating that, not strictly an easy thing, unless you wanted to say maybe set up a direct debit with your favorite supplier, then you've automated the purchase of it, and then it just comes down to using the right quantity. So again, that's a relatively easy thing to do manually anyway, so it doesn't feel like a big win for the automation side of things. Then there's the boil, and that involves, again, it does involve some level of temperature control. Now it does involve a rather higher level. Obviously we need to get the thing up to 100 degrees, which can be can require a bit more power, or so which then might mean stronger heating elements. So therefore, I've kind of opted away from that for now. It's not something. I'm not saying we couldn't automate it later on, but I've, like I said, I've tried to keep myself grounded. And also, when I think to comparing it to something like a packet of pasta that you can buy from a supermarket, quite often I find, unless maybe I'm doing something vastly wrong, but the boiling time on the packet never strictly always matches reality. Sometimes it'll take a bit longer. So therefore, automating that didn't always feel like a guaranteed win. So I'm more than happy to keep this a manual task, and potentially just avoid it by buying the pre-mixed mold. And then finally, we've got the recipe, and this ties in quite nicely with IoT, because a device, the device that's going to be doing the work, isn't going to be doing one thing at one setting. It needs to have some level of dynamic control. So things will change throughout the brewing process, and therefore we can consider that a recipe. Okay. So I mentioned that we've covered sanitation. We're not going to look at it, but we're going to consider it a constraint. So then the next highest priority on the list is to consider the temperature control. And essentially this involves keeping the yeast happy for the right period of time. And I've typically found so that the IPAs that I like to brew typically respond well to about 18 degrees for about 2 weeks. Obviously, there is a range. It depends entirely on the yeast that you're using. So the range for ale yeast is actually up on the screen here, and that's typically between 15 and 22 degrees. And what you'll find is actually the ale yeast like to feed off the top rather than off the bottom. So it makes it clear that we have to make sure that the whole brew is well regulated in terms of temperature. And then you consider a lager yeast that likes to feed off the bottom, but then it also likes to have a lower climate. So actually between 7 and 13 degrees, which, as I mentioned when I did my home brew operation in the spring, that was great, because that was most likely the ambient temperature around about that time of year. But as you can see, over the course of the last week, we had a record high of 28 down in London, and then it dropped to something like 6 degrees. So that's a massive fluctuation in temperature, which would have a fair bit of an impact on the yeast here. So we want to avoid that. We want to be able to create something that can regulate the temperature. But temperature control is easy, right? I mean, I've got one of these Tapo smart plugs in the house for basically a timer. But we could quite easily hook up a smart plug, an electric blanket, and a smart thermometer, and set up a shortcut or workflow on our app on our phone to allow us to turn the temperature on and off based on what the current temperature is. And in theory, it could work. It would be largely inefficient, which we will get to in the later parts of this talk. Plus, it would also make for a rather short talk. So we're not going to do that. We'll move on to something else. And so what's become quite a popular option in the home brewing world is to create something what's called a fermentation chamber. And an ideal candidate for this is actually something like a fridge, because it already provides decent insulation, as well as having the ability to cool. Now, before I've been given permission to override our garage fridge, I've been told that I have to prove that it can be done. So what I've got with me here today is I've hacked a cooler box rather than a fridge. We could probably just jump over and have a quick look, if it will let me. I had a minor issue with my camera setup. I've had to rely on my phone because it GoPro camera that I was trying to use failed miserably yesterday. So we've got there's a cooler box, some of the technologies that are powering it, a whole mess of cables which you don't have to worry too much about now, but we've got a display, cooling element, a fan obviously, some relays, power supply, and then inside we have a mug, a heating element, and a temperature probe. And that mostly covers everything that we need to be looking at. Right, so let me jump back from there. And we can carry on. If I had it in the right way. Right, so back to there. So I appreciate that's rather small and there's lots of kind of wires and cables around. If anyone's interested at the end, I can zoom in. I can even send pictures. I am planning on documenting the whole wiring diagram up on GitHub where the code lives, which I'll share at the end of the talk. But yeah, like I say, feel free if you want to have a closer look, feel free to reach out and I can share any extra details that might help. But for now, I'll walk you through the physical setup, the conceptual setup, and how we can control this with some code. So I mentioned we've got the chamber, that's our square box. And then in order to maintain a good liquid temperature, we need to be able to measure the liquid temperature. So quite often, there are a couple of different approaches that people have tried here. Some people they just measure the temperature of the outside of the container, so they might strap a temperature sensor to the outside because then that doesn't get exposed to the brew. But that can be susceptible to noise because if you're heating the chamber, then the air will most likely be a bit warmer than or it won't be the same as the brew itself. So to get the most accurate reading, the best option is to measure the temperature of the liquid, which we do with a probe that was inside, and I'll get to showing you the exact details of that shortly. But that means this will be exposed to the brewing process, which means it needs to be cleanable. So the thing that I've opted for is a waterproof probe. It's metallic, so it's relatively easy to keep clean. We're also then going to add a heater element because obviously if we want to maintain it, it's a two-step process. We want to know what the temperature is, and then we want to be able to change the temperature. So the aim of the element is to be able to heat the chamber, not necessarily heat the liquid, if that makes sense. You don't want to put the keg or whatever it is you're brewing on directly on top of it, because you're then going to potentially cook the bottom. And actually, as I discovered during a pre-flight demo yesterday, the heater element that I've got inside of here, it's only a 12 volt. It's only a 12 volt, 20 watt heater element. It started to warp the plastic at the bottom of the cooler box. So the plastic's obviously not designed to take temperature of that. So for now, I've ordered some extra parts. But the thing that highlights is the fact that things that come into direct contact with the heater element will be largely affected. So therefore, you most likely you could use like a grill from an oven. So the grid that you have, so you could raise it up, so you're not directly touching. And then, in order to be able to better regulate the air within the chamber, you could stick a fan in, and therefore you're going to make sure that the air flows around. And while I've mentioned heater element, the same is true for the cooling as well. So a heater element is relatively easy to acquire. And relatively easy to wire up. With the Cooler box, it comes with the ability to cool. This is a powered cooler box. And during my testing before I wired it up, it could get down to about 2 degrees, which seemed like a great option. It's not particularly quick. I'll be honest, nowhere near as quick as a fridge, because it's not designed to be as useful as a fridge. It's mostly designed to keep things cool. So the cold crash would be a much slower process, but it certainly is possible. And it does get there. It just takes more time. So I mentioned that we have the fan to circulate it. The other couple of things that I've looked into are whether we could stick a tube in and we could actually pump the brew out of the container and back in, because then that as it flows through, it would then be exposed to the air, the temperature of the chamber, which then would have a potentially a quicker response to heating. But that then also introduces more issues, or more things that could be cleaned, have to be cleaned. And then you've also got other potential issues, like you run a higher chance of running into a leak, or because obviously the pressure can grow, so you have to make sure that you've got a suitable tubing and things like that. So you could have tubing that you replace rather than clean, but then that's also not particularly green if you're going to keep throwing away bits of plastic tubing. And then the other thing that, so some of the work that I do is actually in the biopharma industry at the moment, and some of the work is on things which are bioreactors, which are actually very similar processes aimed at keeping cells or drugs happy, certain things happy so we can manufacture drugs. And one way that they keep the cells happy in the solution is actually to rock them gently back and forth, a bit like a cradle for a baby. So you get these rocking motion bioreactors. Now, they are a nice concept because it's not actually going to expose anything more to the brew, and therefore more things to be cleaned, but it does introduce more moving parts. And if you consider, if you're building, I mean, my keg here is only 10 pints, so it's not particularly heavy. But if you imagine you did a 40-pint one, then you're going to need a much more heavy duty motor to be able to manage that. So that feels like a bit of scope creep. So we're going to avoid that and just solely aim to regulate the temperature of the chamber. And then the final thing that I have been working on is the concept of measuring the ambient temperature. So not the temperature inside the chamber or the liquid, but outside. And the aim of that is to say, well, if it's say 10 degrees outside and we want to get the liquid temperature up to 20, we know that we'll always be fighting to get the temperature up, but never need to fight to get it down. So it would mean that you wouldn't have to turn the cooling element of the fridge or the cooler box on if you overshoot. So therefore you could be a little bit more energy efficient. Yeah, that covers that. So that's a bit about, I guess, the concept of what needs to be solved. So we're looking at building a fermentation chamber, and the aim of that is good temperature control. Now I'd like to move on to a bit of tech, which is I guess the thing that I've opted to use to try and do this, because like I said, I'm a .NET-based developer. I looked at .NET-based IoT options. This is not the only one. I'll be more than honest, open about that. And some of the other work that I've been doing in the repository as well that you'll see, it's very, very early in terms of implementation. But I've been looking at taking the same implementation and putting that on a Raspberry Pi Zero, still with .NET. So I'm still trying to stay in the .NET space, but using another piece of hardware. And it's entirely possible. Some of it does more than what the Meadow board does. Some of it does less. So it's a balancing act. But I think the learnings from each one could feed into each other. So I can show you some of that as we go along. But yes, so like I say, the board that I'm using is the Meadow F7 version 2, which I'm not entirely sure when the version 2 came out, but I've had a V1 since it like kickstarted it back in 2018. So it's been around for a while. And these are they're built from old Android chips. So you can imagine this is almost like the power of an Android device from 10 years ago. But to give a little bit of a background about Meadow, it is a full stack IoT development environment. So you've got all of the functionality here that runs on top of the Mono runtime, and that's inside what they call the Meadow operating system. And the operating system is built on top of the NUTX micro real-time operating system. If no one's heard of that, it is. Well, I guess it is really worth highlighting the fact that it is a micro operating system, which means there really isn't anything else going on. If your app crashes, then the board's not doing anything. You can configure the device to restart if your app crashes for some level of error recovery, but obviously if you're going to keep failing, then it's going to need to be diagnosed. But like I say, it comes with 25 GPIO pins, some 12 up to support PWM pulse width modulation. It's got some analog in, the typical protocols that you would expect: I2C, I2S, SPI, UART CAN. You can even get Modbus on here if you want to. It's got some level of encryption on the board, so any of your secrets, like the Wi-Fi password, things like that you want to connect to, when it uploads them, it sticks them directly on the board and throws them away. So it's never held in any form of memory that could be read. It's got BLE and Wi-Fi on the board, so it's quite easy to be able to hook straight into a home network if you're going to be brewing and wanting to be able to monitor it. And then I mean, it's quite similar spec like that in terms of the Raspberry Pi 02 that I've been looking at as well. It comes with Wi-Fi, but that works quite nicely. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is the fact that it says here it's got a 32 meg of RAM. Now, I know I was talking to an IoT environment, but when I was reading this, it made me start to Google a 32 meg machine, which reminded me of the Pentium 200MX back from 1997. I don't know if anyone remembers one of these. I know we certainly had one in the house. But actually, while I was trying to find a photo, Google kept correcting my search to 32 gig of RAM, because why would I want to be looking at something that would be such a rather limited machine? And this is not to put the board down, but hopefully to draw attention to the limitations that come with building applications for IoT devices. And on that topic, I did. We'll cover out how to solve the problem, but I quite quickly ran into thread starvation as I was writing this. Having multiple sensors always being read on multiple threads, then I quite quickly ran out of available threads, essentially. But like I say, there are easy ways to solve that or to avoid it, which I'll cover shortly. So I guess just to reiterate a bit of what I said on the previous slide, you've got the Meadow operating system, and we'll start from the bottom up. So that's built on top of NUTX, again, which is a micro real-time operating system, and that's an open source OS, so you could grab the code off GitHub if you wanted to. Then there's the .NET or Mono runtime that runs as part of that, and you've then got the operating system services, so whether you want the power or sleep APIs, some security side of things, or things like the health monitoring. So I know Wilderness Labs, the company that make the board, they offer a cloud-based system that allows you to deal with health monitoring and things like that. There is obviously Azure IoT Hub as well, which I think you can get the same data sent up to there. I've also been playing a bit with trying to get that information into an Aspire Hub, which is another .NET-based feature concept that's shipped by the Microsoft teams. Above those two, then we've got the Meadow.core. So this is where you'd actually interact with the hardware APIs directly. So whether you'd want to create access to an analog input port or a digital port, you can do that there. So that that bit comprises the Meadow operating system, and then above that there are separate NuGet packages out there that you can pull into your project that will allow you to so you could actually direct with interact with a peripheral. So you could interact with the BME 680 there, which is a air quality sensor, bit of temperature and humidity, or you could interact with a temperature sensor that similar to like what we've got on the board, so which we can see shortly. But yeah, so that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to go and interact directly with each of the ports, or open something up on SPI and try and send commands to the device. Now, I will say that not everything is supported. So actually, for what I've built here and the demo, in terms of code, you'll see I've got one temperature sensor that is supported, one temperature that isn't, and therefore I can show you how you can solve that when things are not directly supported. Doesn't mean it can't be interacted with. And while I don't want to say it was easy, I did a lot of head scratching, but that was mainly because I was getting my certain interaction with the device. I was having troubles, but that's more kind of the diagnostic side of things, actually understanding how it behaves, because it didn't strictly meet the documentation that I'd received for the sensor. So let's proceed on and have another quick just mention about how I've structured this. Now, if you're all IoT based, then this might feel familiar. Obviously, in a fundamental difference between a typical like business application, which I'm more experienced with working on, versus microcontroller based system, is this concept of a polling loop. In a business application, it just sits there and waits. On a microcontroller based system, it will actually keep polling and check what needs to be done. And what I've done is I've split it into a read and a write. So what we could do is we could read, create some form of immutable state, and then react to that immutable state, rather than kind of having to worry about things being updated during the reads and the writes, or the poll, as it were. And this will feel rather familiar to, it's another topic that I'm quite keen on, is game engines. And in that, you have a polling loop where you typically read user input, update user state, and then write, where you'd render the visuals back to the player, so they could then see the result of their interactions with the game. Right, so that covers, we've got the board. So one thing I haven't actually explained, I'm going to show you some code shortly, but in order to get set up with the Meadow board, there is a get starting guide that I've linked to at the end. But what you essentially need is, you can either use some CLI tools that you can download from their website. You can use, there's a Visual Studio Code extension that works pretty well. And actually that's what I'm using today, because I'm presenting off of a Mac. And Visual Studio Sports obviously disappeared. And then they have a Visual Studio extension for VS for Windows, which you can download, and it does all of the device management for you.
Shaun, I've read a couple of questions. I've been trying to put them on screen.
Oh, sorry, I've seen them. I don't know if that's because I'm presenting.
Here's one. So, what are the key criteria you should be concerned if you want to make a step automated, such as ease of control or the requirement of an instant adjustment based on an external environment? So you might be leading into this, in which case we'll answer it in due course, but I just wanted to make you aware of the question.
Okay. Yes, I think hopefully that the some of the bits that I will cover will show that. This will lead into obviously the inefficiencies that I mentioned with the temperature control. Like I said, we could turn things on and off, but you're not factoring in noise there. I will cover something shortly that does answer that.
Great. And Bruno, Dave, hello, Dave. I think you're in Scotland, aren't you? Is anyone aware of one temperature probe issues with the Raspberry Pi 5? And if so, what's the solution? Did you use one wire temperature probe at all?
No, I do have one. I haven't actually got to setting that up yet.
Okay.
No, I've opted for the PT100 that I'm using at the moment. I know the one wire does the Pi has direct support for 1Y, doesn't it? And it's something you have to enable on the board in order to be able to use it, which I've seen with the documentation from the .NET IoT repository. But there is also mention. Was the question related to .NET based integration or just in general?
In general, like hardware issues.
Okay, I don't know, but if you want to reach out to me, I could probably direct you to people that might be able to answer that question.
So Dave's responded, I'm led to believe that this is due to the GPIOs coming via the PCIe bus and messing up the timing of the serial data stream. I've not been able to find a solution yet. So it might be hardware based.
Oh, okay. Yes.
If it's Raspberry Pi.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I had a few issues with the bus when I was interacting with my PT100. And basically what it boiled down to is I had to follow, I found some C++ code that I then had to migrate across. And I made 2 key mistakes, which meant that the bus wasn't quite doing my code wasn't doing what the bus needed it to do, or the device needed it to do. But yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to direct you to people that probably will be able to answer that question better than I can. Okay.
Thanks for that.
No worries. Right. So I've done the polling loop. So we've been talking about temperature sensors, so I'll just quickly jump over. This little one comes with the Meadow board that I've put on the board, and I'm using this to measure the ambient temperature. I'm going to keep jumping back and forth between Visual Studio Code because it seems to be a bit easier to show the code with syntax and all of that, because sticking it in a slide always seems to lose some of the context. But what I can hopefully show you is the fact that, so I've just created a class that does temperature monitoring. There's a general purpose interface that is a temperature sensor, so it provides you with certain properties like the temperature down here property, and also methods, so you can actually start it. So what we do is when we initialize it, we create a new analog temperature, point it at the analog pin that we want to use, and then the Meadow actually comes with a set of known sensors. So if we were to open here, you'd see that there's a few of it that it currently supports. So that's all well and good. That works quite nicely for ambient temperature. If you haven't wired it up the wrong way and blown it up, which I've done a couple of times now.
Sorry, Shaun, could you make the text a bit bigger? It's just a little difficult to read. Thank you.
Yes, okay. So basically all this will do is it will this will kick off a background thread, and it'll monitor by default, if you don't pass in a time span here, every 5 seconds for you. And therefore it'll then have a cached value of temperature here that you can just read when you want to. You could, if you wanted to, directly call read, but as it currently stands, everything that I've built here, I just want it to all kind of be up to date. So therefore I've just allowed it to run in the background process. And this is where I initially ran into, as I mentioned, thread starvation, because if you have lots of threads running, it will then, if you have lots of sensors updating themselves, then you could potentially run into this issue because they have one thread per sensor. But to avoid that, if you register your sensor with what's known as this sensor service, it has one thread that sits there in the background and will then allocate some time for each sensor to be able to perform its read, and therefore it becomes a lot more of an optimized process. You don't run into the issue of this thread starvation, as I mentioned. It doesn't necessarily mean that all sensors are supported by it. If it's not, it'll just run as it used to. It'll just consume its own background thread. If it does, then it will hook itself into the shared one. So there's no exceptions or errors that will be thrown. It'll just resort back to the default behavior, which is quite nice. Okay, so as I mentioned, that was that one. The next item is then the liquid temperature sensor. So obviously the one you saw before, let me just jump back. You can see those the pins there are exposed, which is not going to do well if it becomes wet. You're going to short out. So we needed to look for a something that's suitable for being able to touch liquid. And I frantically searched on the internet, and I bought some 1 wires. I've got a pack of 5 here that I started to play with. I didn't have much luck in terms of the Meadow board, but what I had a bit more luck with was the PT100, which is actually, we use the PT1000s on the current project that I'm on. So that felt rather familiar in terms of knowing that it should work, and it's to work to a good standard. Although I have heard very good things about the 1 wires. The PT100 is what is actually known as a resistance temperature detector, which means its resistance changes based on the temperature. So you pass a small current, maybe 1 milliamp, through it, and then you'll get a voltage reading out. You don't want to go much more than 5 milliamps, because you'll then actually start self-heating the probe, and it'll read inaccurate values. But because in order to get a decent reading as well, you want to use a fairly high voltage, I'd say 12 to maybe 24 volts. The Meadow board is just like the Raspberry Pi, though. It can only put out 3.3 or 5 volts. So what you then use is this thing on the right-hand side, which is the Max 31865, yes, which will allow you to convert the values across, and it'll handle all of the calculations to make sure that you're getting an accurate reading. And this board on the right, so the sensor that you can buy, you can either get the PT100 or the PT1000. And they come in 2, 3, and 4 wire configurations. I have a 2 and a 3 wire here with me. It's a 3 wire that's wired into the cooler box at the moment. And what you see on the right hand side, there's little jumper bits that you need to solder based on whether you have got a 2, a 3, or a 4 wire option. So the board here is specific to the PT100 or the PT1000. There are 2 variations of the board, but short of the wires, you can configure the board to suit how you want. So that works fine. To quickly jump out then and show you the code for this. So this board is not supported by the Meadow codebase, but you should see here actually it looks pretty much the same as the one before. And that's because actually what I've done is like I say, I end up taking the C# the C++ code, and I've converted it across to C# to do that for us. So this is a little bit more involved. This is where you'd actually have to get down to the layer of interacting with the SPI bus here. So you'll just have to read and write registers essentially. So the key logic here is this is a fairly well documented, at least all of the samples that are found from the Raspberry Pi code, the .NET-based code that supports a Raspberry Pi, and also there's some Adafruit libraries that C++ that do the same thing. So basically, you set some registers, you read a register, and then you turn the registers off again just to make sure you're not going to overheat the sensor. And that then gets you a reading back, which is great. And like I say, I've structured this in a way that looks just like a normal temperature sensor, in the hope that I could potentially submit this back to the Meadow team. So therefore, it could then become a supported feature rather than other people having to write this. But yeah, so then, like I say, is then you can then use this in a code base that looks familiar to the other one, which is nice. Maybe speed up a little bit, because I think I've got a bit more to cover than time had intended. So then the next thing is heating and cooling, which what I've opted to do here is I'm using a relay. Now, technically, in terms of the heating, I could probably use a controllable MOSFET. So actually, I could control the voltage that goes to the heating element. But with the cooling element here, I can't. It's only really an on or on off. And then when I got to the higher, the holy grail of actually being able to modify the fridge in the garage, that runs off 230 volts. Now, I could well probably might be able to get a controllable MOSFET that would deal with that, but again, it's at least the compressor side of things, it would be an on or an off again. So it would most likely be a relay. In the rig that I've got here, I've actually opted for mechanical relays purely because it makes the demo ever so slightly animated. You can hear the clicking, but they have a shorter lifespan. So if you're going to use relays, I would thoroughly recommend a solid state relay because it has a much longer lifespan. And then if we jump over to the code again and we have a look at the code for that, what you should see is we've got a cooling element. So we've got a relay. We point it at the pin that controls whether it's open or closed. And then there's a little bit of logic here to say, well, if we need to heat, so if the current temperature is lower than the target temperature, then we will open it, which means it will then be cooling, sorry. Oh, sorry. It's inverse, isn't it? So closed is on, open is off. So if it's less than, or if the liquid temperature is cooler than the target temperature or equal to, then we won't do anything. Otherwise, we will then turn it on and start cooling. And then the inverse is true for the heating. So it's a different pin, and then we'll close it if the liquid temperature is lower to make sure that we are then heating up the brew. Right.
Shaun, Dave's asking, do you have any control over the mash and boil steps?
At the moment, yes. Well, at the moment, that's entirely manual. At the moment, so the bit that I've at least built is just you'll have made your brew and you put it away for 2 weeks and leave it to be happy. I haven't worked out the best way to automate the boil step in the safest way, because then, like you say, there's always the mashing process as well. So that's a rather involved process to automate, which I've not solved yet. But I'm open to suggestions if people have them. Okay, so I'm just going to jump on if that's okay, if that answers the question, or doesn't answer it, but I don't have a solution to that yet. All right. Now, obviously, we mentioned that the code that I've shown you now gives you the ability to measure the temperature and control the temperature. So we could ship it, but again, this takes us back to the heated blanket approach, which again is rather inefficient. So let's look at why. Hopefully this will then start to get close to answering the question that came up a short while ago in terms of dealing with environmental factors and things like that. So the simplest algorithm would be to do what we've said. We'll just turn it on when it's not warm enough, and we'll turn it off when it's too hot or when it is the right temperature. But the problem is you will have residual heat in the element, which means when you turn it off, there will still be some level of heating. And then when the temperature starts to drop again, by the time you turn the heater element on, it will have dropped further, which means you'll get this oscillation on the temperature graph, this leads to inefficiencies. But there is a solution, and that's some rather complicated maths, which I'm not going to break down now. Don't worry, but there is a solution which comes in the form of proportional integral derivative, or PID. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with PID. The way I always like to look back at it is, most people will always use it, whether it's the heating control system in their house, or even if you drive a car, cruise control in a car will use PID to make sure that you reach a speed safely and efficiently. But even if you don't have cruise control, at a human level, you will still apply the same level of algorithm when you're driving the car. If you imagine you're coming on to a slip road, you want to reach 70 miles an hour. If you periodically look down at the speed that the car is doing, you will see that it's increasing, and then you look down again and it's increased some more. By the time you get close to 70, you're not going to keep going flat on the floor because you'll massively overshoot. You will realize that you're reaching your target, and you will lift your foot off, assuming you're obviously going at the speed limit. But yeah, so that's there is some level of humans do apply this, but you don't have to do all the complicated maths in your head. It just happens. It's a kind of an instinctual thing. But if we look at how that happens, and hopefully this might feed a little bit into the question now, is this concept called control theory. So PID uses what's called a closed loop gain controller, with the aim of being that you've got in the top left here, you've got the target signal. So this is the temperature, or this is the 70 miles an hour that you want to reach. So you know that you've taken 2 seconds, you've looked down at the speed the car's going, and it's now doing 62. That's your output. No, that's not, sorry. That's you know that you've gained by 2. The actual signal will then tell you that you're doing 62, and therefore you're then going back into the input saying, well, now I'm doing 62, but I want to be at 70. And then you'll get an output that will say, well, you need to have your foot down for 100% of the time, or 100%. You need to have your foot flat on the floor. And then eventually you'll see that your signal is growing, your actual signal is growing much closer to the target signal. And therefore, at some point, the output will then reduce from 100% down to maybe 75 or 50 to make sure that you then reach the speed in an efficient way, but a safe way as well. And what that then leads to is this graph here, you see, and this is aimed at showing temperature, or it could show 20 miles an hour. But what you'll see is you've got a target of, I think that's meant to be 21 there. And you'll see as you get closer, the slope then reduces, which means that the control coming out of the algorithm is saying, well, you don't need to be heating for the entire time, or you don't need your foot flat on the floor. You can reduce the power, and therefore there will still be some level of overshoot, but then and a little bit of undershoot, but then you should start to get to a smooth line. And then this then means that you'll be continually applying this algorithm each time you're working out how much to heat. And therefore, when you get a bit of noise, say someone opens the lid or the door to have a look at how the beer's doing, you will get a fluctuation, but then you will be able to recover from that through the use of this algorithm. And to have a quick look at that, this is the bit that I really like about what comes with a Meadow library.
Just quickly, Dudu OK has asked, is there any alerting based on that sensor data? And I assume she means the temperature data, so you can, if like the PID doesn't work or something.
Yes, I mean you can output as much as you like. So the bit at the moment, I've got a little screen up here that will report things if it doesn't tell you, if it's not doing what you expect. And the bit that I'm now working on is a bit more of the back end. So I'm trying to stay entirely within .NET. So at the moment, it will send up the sensor readings to a web API, and then you could then report out from that to maybe a mobile client or even an email to say, I've not received a temperature sensor reading for X period of time, or I'm reporting 100 degrees, which is obviously outside of the bounds of what you would expect to see. That's entirely possible. But in terms of PID, what you can do here is you've got the 3 controllable elements, which is PI and D. Some of these feel a bit like magic values sometimes, but essentially, when you want to tune these relate to a bit of the thermal model or the thermodynamics of the thing that you've built. So when you realize, so based on different heater element that you've got will affect the speed of the ramp, and then you can tune these values in order to get that accurate graph that I showed you on the previous slide. What you can do though with the tool, so the library comes with the standard PID controller. There's also an ideal, so there's 2 different PID algorithms that you can use. I'm using standard because it is the most common one that most people use. You can tell it the min and max, so it's going to calculate its control output will be between 0 and 100%. So we're either going to be foot flat on the floor or up, but it can be a percentage between that. And then like I say, so you can control these, and in order to tweak these, what you can do is you can turn on this which will output the tuning information. So it'll give you a big dump into a log file. And then you can take that and put it into like an online PID simulator. And then you can tweak the PID values in that simulator to then finally tune your model. And then you can put those values back into here and then run it again. And then you'll start to see that you'll get that nice little a little bump in the graph, but then just a flat line, which is precisely what you want to be seeing. And so like I showed on one of those slides, there was a lot of complicated maths, but it's actually all done for you through the libraries that come with the framework. So you just tell it the actual and the target, so the current liquid temperature and the target, and then it will tell you how much power to apply. Which is great. So if I then jump back to the slides, what we will then see, sorry, I've clicked the wrong button. There we go. Yes, okay. So, but basically, because I'm using relays in the system, there is no turn the heater element on to 75%. It's either on or it's off. Like I say, we could change that mechanism by redesigning some of the circuit. We could take the relays out and we could put something like a controllable MOSFET in, but again, that wouldn't work for the cooling element because that doesn't respond to different power levels. It's either on or it's off. So again, maybe there are cooler elements out there that could, but in order to fit with what I currently got, I looked at another solution for this, and that's pulse width modulation. And this is actually how LED lights remain bright without burning out quickly. And if anyone's taken a photo, I think my camera does it here as well. I don't know if anyone's noticed. You get the horizontal lines on the screen, and that's basically interference caused between the frequency of the lights are oscillating and the speed of the shutter on the camera. So yeah, that's just a bit of noise. If you turn the lights off, then you won't see that at all. But yeah, so like I said, that's a way that LEDs can stay bright but not burn out. They're not on all the time. And that's how we can then control this. So if we wanted to have a 75% duty cycle, so we're going to say over a period of time, the heater element will be on 75% of the time and off 25%, then you could do that through pulse width modulation. So you've got two controllable elements. You've got the frequency, so in hertz. So if we said 1 hertz, that's every second. And we're looking at the bottom graph, we can say 75%. So it would then be on 75% of the time. So 45 seconds on and then 15 seconds off. And the final bit for the code then is what we can then see is then, again, the Meadow code gives us, it gives us multiple. So actually, I don't know if you recall on the slide where I showed you the board, it does come with, I think, 12, I think, PWM ports. So some ports that do actually support PWM at a hardware level. I've just opted for the soft one, so you don't have to be limited. If you actually needed 13, you still can achieve that. And basically the code, there's some code that they provide that does it for you. So you tell it the frequency. So at the moment I'm saying 0.1 hertz, so that's 10 seconds. And then a duty cycle is basically the output of the PID controller. So if it says you need to heat for 40% of the time, it will then be on for 4 seconds and off for 60. And that's the way that you can then be able to control the heater element and how long it's on for. I think that covers the code for now.
So Shaun, Gary's asking, did you consider using the Peltier cooler and heater module with MOSFET and PWM for cooling and heating?
I did not. Can I get a pen and write that down? No,
it sounds like a good suggestion, though.
It does. It really does. Yeah. No.
The way it's angled as a question, when it's clearly some advice. Yes, so we'll just leave it there. Thank you, Gary.
Yes, thank you, Gary. No, I tried to work within the limitations of what I already had. So, like I say, with the fridge, it's already got the cooler element in there. I didn't fancy going too drastic. but I will certainly be researching that after this talk to see how I could get that to fit in. Yeah, I mean, the relays certainly have a limitation, and it would be nice to avoid using that. So if that cooler element does the job, I might be adding more cost to this project than I had originally intended. But no, that's great. Thank you. I will have a look at that. We've covered that. So that mostly kind of covers what it is that I've been doing. There is a little bit. So I know this is not strictly a .NET meetup, but the bit that I've been trying to do is to encompass the whole brewing process just using .NET. So what we've got on the bottom, so we've got the device itself that's running on a Meadow, although I'm also currently playing around with a Raspberry Pi Zero because I seem to have nothing better to do. But again, it's both running .NET code. The Meadow code libraries do claim they have support for Raspberry Pi. I say claim. I mean, it says they do, so it must do. I've not tried it, but I'm also familiar with there's a .NET specific IoT frameworks that do target a Raspberry Pi, and I've used it in the past with my children in the house. We've built a wildlife camera, so I've tried to take that knowledge and then try and turn that in. So you can have, can't see my pointer, but on the bottom left where it says Meadow, there could be a Raspberry Pi there as well, so we could have either device there. And the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 is something like £15, whereas the Meadow is about 40. So you could quite easily make a chunk of saving just by changing the board. But it's got all the similar ports and power ratings, so even same form factor. So I think it would be an easy thing to change, short of obviously the code, which is the bit that I'm working on at the moment. Then I've got so there's Aspire, is that triangular logo there, which it gives you a nice way to kind of group like cloud-based services together and kind of be able to orchestrate it quite easily. It also comes with a nice kind of dashboard for diagnostics. You get logging and tracing that come in a centralized dashboard. So I've been trying to host that on a Raspberry Pi, a low-powered device in the house that could then serve as the thing that receives the data from the device, and then also that's where I could log in and connect and create a different recipe and kick off a recipe if I wanted to. And then finally, my primary focus in terms of side projects has been around .NET MAUI, and that is the .NET MAUI logo now. So I've been working on a mobile client that could then connect to the Web2 API to then also be able to control it, because my mobile development skills are much better than my HTML skills. So if there is time, we can show a quick bit of code. So I did show you these elements. Those were kind of built for the slides. But if you were to take a look at the code base up on GitHub, it's a project called Brew IoT. So like I say, there's a server-side thing, there's a client-side thing. So there's a MAUI application. Server-side, you've got API and web and some data layer that I'm trying to iron out some of the issues, but that's almost there. And then on the Meadow side of things, you've got a Meadow app, so you can create it, you can bootstrap it. So what I've created is a job controller. So the aim is that the IoT device will then talk to the server and say, well, what am I supposed to be doing? Then a temperature controller that will then read the values and control the temperature, the heating and the cooling based on that. And then there is a display on the box that you should then be able to see that will then put the values on a little screen. There's a little LCD screen, which is just 4 rows by 20 characters. So you don't get a lot of detail on it, but it's enough to be able to show you what's going on. And then, yeah, I've kind of grouped the different bits of information between the lot. So the display controller literally just takes values from other controllers and then puts it on the screen. And then there's PT100. That's actually that was an investigation work. This is the most complicated one, the temperature one, which doesn't fit nicely now that I've zoomed in. But what you see is it's got multiple temperature sensors. It's got the relays from the previous slides code, and then the PID controller, and then it will go through. It will then start to calculate things based on what readings it's got further down. So you read it in, work out some temperatures, and then actually write it back to do that.
So Shaun, Doodoo OK has asked, what will happen if the temperature values were not accurate and it gets overly heated? Is there any preventative or recovery set up for cooling it down?
At the moment, I would expect to get an alert. I haven't put kind of fail safes in. I suspect it's a very good question. I think that there will need to be. So if you're like similar to some other scenarios where you kind of reach an overpressure, then you'd kind of go and open a valve to let the pressure out. We could look to try and do the inverse. I guess sometimes if one thing's not working, you obviously want to make sure it's not strictly electronic related. So if you can't turn the heater on, can you still turn the cooler on? If both things fail, then what do? Do you just shut it off and hope for the best? Or whether you can vent the heat out like that. At the moment, no, you can't. But I will add that to the list. That's a good idea. The other thing that you can do with the Meadow is you can create simulator sensors, which means it will you can run different simulation models. They're relatively simple. They're not like complex thermal models that they replicate, but you could kick it off and get it to randomly fluctuate between different temperatures if you wanted to, or randomly change. So if you don't have a sensor plugged into your board, you could run it in simulation mode, which can work quite nicely. Yeah, so that's then pieces it all together, and then so you can open up a HTTP request. I've commented out at the moment because there is a build issue. There's a trimming issue where it doesn't like the latest version of JSON, which I ran into over the weekend. Now I believe there is a fix that they are about to release, or you can downgrade your JSON to a system.txt or JSON to an older version 7. Anything above 7, I think, causes the issue. It's a very obscure issue. It doesn't tell you what exactly the problem is with some of these weird bugs, because in order to keep the deployed code as small as possible, it uses a similar process to what the .NET MAUI side of things does, and actually some of the more common .NET applications now. When you build something to go on a device, it performs things like tree shaking, which it will try to detect what things are really being used, and then as the saying goes, you shake the tree, and anything that it's not really using kind of falls out, and then it removes it from the compilation, which means you can get your build down as small as possible. So if you reference a library that's 1 megabyte in size, but you're only using 100 kilobytes, it should compile that DLL down to 100 kilobytes for you to only use the bits that you're really using. Right, so the one thing we can do, so as I mentioned, there is the extension here, which is the Meadow. This will be the last little bit that I can show you. So there's a VS tools for Meadow. What it'll do is it'll give you, when you go to the run and debug option, it'll give you a funky little name for the device that you've got plugged in, and then you can run it. It'll kick off, do a little build, and then we should see nothing happening. Oh, I'm in the wrong tab. That's why debug console is the one we wanted. So yes, you'll see it. It's basically uploading all of the built files. What it does come with, so there's a number of configuration files, and they chose YAML for some reason. what you'll see is, so like I said before, you can tell the board to restart the app if it fails. You can configure the logging, so where that goes up to. You can use Meadow Cloud, so you can enable over-the-air updates if you wanted to, or health metrics, and then you can put your own configuration values in at the end. There's also things like the Wi-Fi. We're fine. I haven't put mine in here, which these will be kind of uploaded to the device and then thrown away, so you don't have to worry about that information leaking. You'll just see that it'll get there, but then, yeah, like I said, you won't have to worry about that. And then there's some other bits, like you can configure the IP address and things like that if you want to, and the name of your device if you want to provision it in a certain way. What you can see now is it is running. It's just sticking out a lot of log and at the moment, but at the moment I've set it so there's a target of 26 degrees and the liquid temperature is currently reading 19. Now, if I take the sensor out, the most accurate way to boost this is to stick it in my mouth. There you go. It's jumped up to 23.6. And now it's jumped over to 27, and you'll see that the cooling's kicked in. So it's saying you need to cool because you've overshot. And then I think I've got some water here as well that I could dip it in to cool it back down. Apologies, this is not always the most animated of demos. And then it's turned itself off, heating now. So it's dropped down to 23.6. So the heating element's going to kick in. So, I mean, it's quite difficult to visualize heating or temperature control as a demo, but that hopefully summarizes it. Like I say, there is a screen here, which I could probably show you, but it might be quite tricky to see.
We're a fair bit over time now, Shaun. If you could wrap up, that would be great.
That's no problem. So I'll just stick that up. That covers everything. I'd like to say cheers. Thank you very much for coming to listen. The first link there is the code repo that has the board support on it, as well as the other bits that I'm working on, and this will actively be developed and enhanced. And then for the Meadow board specifically is the link at the bottom, which is developer.wildernesslabs.co. That gets you started.
Cool. Thanks very much. Bruno Dave says he can help with the mashing and heating steps. My understanding is Dave's a bit further along the process. So you guys should definitely get connected.
Yes, please.
Sounds like a match made in heaven. That's fantastic. We've had quite a lot of engagement today. That's brilliant. Thanks to everyone that turned up. Thanks to our speaker, Shaun.
Thank you.
Thanks to the Edge AI Hub for making it all possible. We'll see you next month for a roundtable on how getting IoT projects out into production and out of proof of concept purgatory.
Sounds like I need to come along to that.
Great, and I hope to see you all next month. And now I will press the right button.